The cruelest pain isn't death. It's watching your children look you in the eye while plotting to drug you for your property. Wait until you hear how I made sure they paid for every tear they caused me. Before I begin, please subscribe to Wise Revenge and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I never imagined my life would reach such a point. For most of my years, I lived with the belief that family was sacred, that blood would never betray blood. I was a father who worked his hands raw, breaking my back for decades to put food on the table, to make sure my children had opportunities I could only dream of when I was young. Every nail hammered into the walls of my house carried the weight of my sacrifices. Every brick laid carried the memory of my wife who stood by me through poverty, through hunger, through all the storms life could throw. That house was more than 4 walls and a roof. It was my history, my love, my identity. After my wife passed, the home became the last living connection to her. I kept everything the same, from the curtains she stitched by hand to the roses she planted in the garden. I told myself that one day, when I was gone, the children would inherit this place not just as property, but as a symbol of their mother's devotion and my years of struggle. That thought gave me comfort. It gave me peace. But peace is fragile when greed poisons the heart. My children, the very ones I raised with sleepless nights and empty stomachs, began to change. I didn't see it at first. To me, they were still the babies I held, the young ones who clung to my shirt when they were afraid of thunder. But slowly, words began to cut deeper than knives. Little comments about old people not needing such big houses, or maybe it's time to think about the future. At first, I brushed it off. Children talk. They don't understand the weight of their words. But soon, it wasn't just talk. It was glances exchanged behind my back, hushed voices when I entered the room, silence that stretched like a shadow over every meal we shared. I wanted to believe it was nothing. I wanted to believe my children would never betray me. But deep down, a storm was brewing, and I was too blind, too hopeful, to see that the ones I loved most were preparing to strike at the very heart of everything I had left. The early signs of greed often come disguised as concern. My children began speaking in softer tones, pretending their questions came from a place of care. "Dad, don't you think it's hard for you to keep up with the house all alone?" they'd ask. Or, "Wouldn't it be easier if someone younger managed your finances?" I wanted to believe these were harmless comments, just the voices of children worried about their father's age. But something in their eyes made me uneasy. It wasn't love, it was calculation. At family gatherings, when neighbors or relatives came around, my children wore masks of affection. They spoke sweetly, placed their hands on my shoulders, and told everyone how much they cared for me. But once the guests were gone, the warmth melted away like snow in the sun. My eldest son grew impatient whenever I spoke of keeping the house as it was. My daughter, who once laughed with me in the kitchen, now sighed and rolled her eyes when I reminisced about her mother's garden. Their kindness had limits, and those limits were drawn around their desire for my property. At night, I would sit alone in the living room, staring at the photos on the wall, wondering if I had failed as a father. Had I not given enough, or had I given too much? The more I replayed the conversations in my head, the more I realized their words were not slips of the tongue. They were rehearsed. Each suggestion about preparing for the future or getting things in order was carefully planted, repeated until I began to question myself. They wanted me to believe I was too old, too fragile, too lost to manage my own affairs. One evening, I overheard them whispering in the kitchen. My son's voice was sharp, impatient. "We can't wait forever. Dad doesn't need all this. We should convince him to sign over the property before it's too late." My daughter replied, "Don't push him too hard. He still thinks he's in control. We need to make him feel like it's his idea." Their words sliced through me like blades. My own children, the ones I sacrificed everything for, plotting how to strip me of the very home that held my wife's memory. I sat silently in the next room, my hands trembling, my chest heavy with grief. The betrayal wasn't just in their words, but in the cold certainty of their tone. They weren't confused, they weren't misguided, they were united, and they were coming for everything I had left. As the months passed, the resentment in my children only deepened. It wasn't just their voices anymore. It was the whispers of their spouses, the in-laws who saw my home not as a memory, but as a prize waiting to be claimed. My eldest son's wife, in particular, carried herself with a smug arrogance that made my skin crawl. She never said it directly to my face, but I often caught her looking around my house with eyes that measured every chair, every lamp, every piece of land, as if it already belonged to her. One evening, I walked into the living room and found her alone, flipping through the old photo albums of my wife. She closed it quickly, smiling at me as if she'd been admiring the memories, but her eyes betrayed her. They weren't softened by nostalgia. They were sharp, calculating. Later that night, I overheard her whispering to my son, "Why let him waste away in this big place? He's holding us back. We deserve to enjoy it while we're young." My son, instead of defending me, nodded quietly. My daughter wasn't any different. Her husband, a man who rarely worked and often relied on others for support, began circling like a vulture. He constantly hinted that maintaining a property of this size was too much for an old man. He would bring it up at family dinners, trying to sound casual, but every word was dipped in poison. "Uncle down the road sold his house and moved into a smaller place," he'd say. "Smart decision at his age. Maybe it's something you should consider." My daughter would glance at him and then at me, her silence saying more than words ever could. I began to feel surrounded in my own home. The laughter that once filled the halls had turned to echoes of greed. I noticed how they all exchanged glances when I spoke about the past, as though my stories of sacrifice meant nothing. Their visits, once filled with warmth and family closeness, now felt like inspections, as though they were measuring how much longer they would have to wait before everything I had built became theirs. The weight of their stares pressed on me more heavily than my own age. It was no longer just about impatience, it was about entitlement. They had convinced themselves that what I had was already theirs, and I was merely standing in the way. I realized then that the betrayal wasn't only coming from my children, but from the very people who married into the family and fueled their greed like kindling to a fire. The pressure didn't stop at whispers and hints. Soon their words grew bolder, their tone sharper, their patience thinner. What once came disguised as concern now came dressed as authority. "Dad, you can't keep doing this on your own," my son insisted one evening, his wife standing beside him with folded arms and a smug smile. "You're not as strong as you used to be. Why don't you let us handle the property? It's too much stress for you." His words dripped with false kindness, but his eyes betrayed him. They weren't eyes of a loving son. They were the eyes of a man calculating his gain. My daughter chimed in too, carefully chosen words meant to sting. "We're not saying you can't take care of yourself," she said, "but what if something happens? What if you fall or forget something important? Don't you think it would be smarter to let us manage everything before it's too late?" The way she said "before it's too late" made my stomach turn. It wasn't fear for my safety. It was fear that she might miss her chance to snatch what she believed was hers. Even the in-laws joined in the chorus. At family dinners, they painted pictures of security and convenience. "Think about how much easier your life would be," my daughter-in-law said, with a sweet smile that masked her venom. "You wouldn't have to worry about bills, taxes, or repairs. We'd handle it all for you. You could finally relax, I thought bitterly, while they feasted on the fruits of my labor. Relax, while they stripped away the last thing that tied me to my wife's memory. They didn't realize I could see through them. Every word they spoke was another thread in the web they were weaving around me, but I stayed silent, nodding, pretending to consider their suggestions. It was easier to let them believe I was weak, easier to let them think their plan was working. Deep down, though, the betrayal burned like fire in my chest. To hear my own children speak as though I were a burden, as though I were some fragile old man standing in the way of their happiness. It was more painful than any illness, more devastating than any wound. I realized then that they weren't just asking. They were conditioning me, slowly tightening their grip, hoping to break me down until I willingly signed away the very thing that kept me alive. It wasn't long before their words turned into actions. One afternoon, my eldest son arrived with a stack of papers in his hand, his expression carefully arranged to look sympathetic. "Dad," he said gently, placing the documents on the table, "these are just routine forms. Nothing serious, just a little help with managing the house. All you have to do is sign, and we'll take care of the rest. You won't have to stress about anything anymore." His wife stood behind him, her lips curved in a polite smile, but her eyes glittered with triumph. I picked up the papers and pretended to scan through them, though I could hardly focus as my heart pounded in my chest. The legal jargon was dense, but one line caught my attention. Something about transfer of management rights. I may not be a lawyer, but I wasn't foolish. I knew what those words meant. They were trying to dress up theft as kindness. I looked up at my son, who was shifting nervously, as if afraid I might ask too many questions. "What exactly am I signing here?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. He waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, Dad, don't worry about the details. It's just a precaution. We'll handle everything for you. Trust us. We only want what's best." The word trust lodged itself in my throat like a stone. Once, I trusted him with my life. Now, I couldn't even trust him with a piece of paper. I set the pen down deliberately and pushed the papers back across the table. "I'll read this properly later," I said. His wife's smile faltered, and I saw the flash of frustration in her eyes before she quickly masked it. My son forced a laugh. "Of course, Dad, of course. No rush." But the tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. After they left, I sat alone at the table, staring at the documents. My hands trembled, not with weakness, but with rage. They thought I was too old, too tired, too blind to notice. They thought they could slip lies beneath my nose, and I'd sign away everything without question. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced the house, haunted by memories of their childhood laughter, their small hands clutching mine, and the cold realization that those same hands were now reaching to strangle the last part of my life I still controlled. Loneliness became my only companion in those days. The house that once echoed with laughter now felt like a cage closing in on me. I would walk from room to room, touching the furniture my wife had chosen, breathing in the faint scent of her perfume that still lingered in the closet. Each memory was both a comfort and a knife to the heart, because I knew my children didn't see what I saw. To them, this place wasn't sacred. It was a prize, and every visit they paid me was less about love and more about strategy. I longed for the warmth of family, but what I received instead was distance dressed up as concern. They called less often, and when they did, the conversations circled back to the same points: my age, my health, my supposed inability to manage. It was as if they were reading from a script, each of them repeating the same lines, rehearsed and polished until the message drilled into my mind. You are weak, you are old, you need us. And for a moment, I almost believed it. That was their power. The slow erosion of my confidence, the steady drip of poison in my ears. One evening, as I sat alone on the porch, I heard voices coming from inside. My children didn't know I had stepped out, and their whispers carried through the thin walls of the living room. My daughter's voice was low, urgent. "We can't wait much longer. He's still stubborn, but he's getting older every day. If we don't act now, we'll regret it." My son responded, his tone cold, stripped of any affection. "I know. I'll make him sign one way or another. He won't even realize what he's doing. Once it's done, he'll have no choice but to accept it." My heart pounded in my chest as I pressed myself against the wall, straining to catch every word. The casual way they spoke of taking everything from me, as if I were already gone, shattered something inside me. These weren't careless words. This was a plan. My children, the ones I had carried in my arms, the ones whose tears I had wiped away, whose bellies I had fed, were plotting against me. I returned to my chair on the porch before they noticed I was gone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I had feared their greed, but hearing their betrayal laid out so plainly stripped away the last veil of denial. They weren't just circling like vultures anymore. They were preparing to strike, and I was the carcass they were waiting to pick clean. After that night, everything they did seemed laced with hidden intent. My daughter suddenly began visiting more often, bringing home-cooked meals and fussing over me in ways she hadn't since she was a child. My son would show up with groceries I hadn't asked for, insisting I let him make me tea, pouring it himself with a smile that never reached his eyes. On the surface, it looked like kindness, like a family finally trying to reconnect. But I knew better. Their voices were too sweet, their gestures too perfect, like actors rehearsing a play. At first, I forced myself to accept their sudden attention. Maybe, I thought, I was wrong. Maybe the whispers I overheard were taken out of context. But then came the moments that twisted my doubt into certainty. One evening, my son handed me a cup of tea, urging me to drink it quickly while it was hot. I lifted it to my lips, but the bitter taste that hit my tongue wasn't the tea I'd been drinking all my life. I set the cup down, pretending not to notice, while my son's eyes flickered nervously. "Not thirsty?" I said casually, pushing it away. He smiled too quickly, as if relieved, then excused himself to the kitchen. Another time, My daughter served me soup she claimed she had cooked just for me, but the broth was strangely cloudy, and a chalky residue clung to the spoon. I stirred it slowly, watching her eyes follow my every movement. When I didn't take a sip right away, she pushed the bowl closer. "Eat, Dad. You need your strength." The words were tender, but her tone was firm, almost demanding. I raised the spoon, touched it to my lips, then set it back down. "I'm not hungry tonight," I said softly. Her shoulders stiffened. She tried to hide it, but I saw the flicker of disappointment, the calculation behind her forced smile. Each attempt chipped away at what little love I had left for them. I began to realize their plan wasn't to wait patiently for me to give in. They were moving faster, trying to weaken me, trying to cloud my mind until I signed whatever papers they shoved under my nose. And still, I said nothing. I played the fool, the tired old man too slow to catch on. But inside, my fury burned hotter with every sip I refused, every meal I left untouched. If they thought I was blind to their treachery, they were in for a reckoning they would never forget. The night of their betrayal arrived without warning, though in truth I had been expecting it. My son and daughter came together, unusually cheerful, carrying bags of food, and speaking in voices that dripped with false affection. "We thought we'd have dinner as a family tonight," my daughter announced, setting the table as though it were some grand celebration. I sat quietly, my eyes watching every move, every gesture, as though I were observing strangers instead of my own flesh and blood. They insisted I sit at the head of the table, piling food onto my plate before I could even reach for the spoon. My son poured me a glass of water, then placed a cup of tea by my side, his hand lingering on the handle, as though making sure I wouldn't resist. "Drink up, Dad," he said, his smile stretched too tight across his face. My daughter added quickly, "Yes, you need your strength. We've brought something important for you tonight." The way she said it sent chills down my spine. I lifted the cup, inhaling the faint bitter scent that no normal tea should have carried. My stomach turned, but I forced my hand to tremble just slightly, as if I were weak and unaware. I took a small sip, letting the liquid touch my tongue, before I placed the cup back down, feigning fatigue. "I'm tired," I muttered, leaning back into the chair, pretending as though the drug was already taking hold. Their eyes lit up with relief, a cruel satisfaction passing between them, as though they believed victory was finally theirs. My son slid a folder across the table, his voice soft but commanding. "Dad, it's just a few forms. Nothing complicated. If you sign these, we can take care of everything for you. No more stress, no more worry. You can finally rest." My daughter pulled the papers from the folder, laying them neatly in front of me, pushing a pen into my hand. "Please, Dad, just sign. We'll handle it all." Inside, rage thundered in my chest, but outwardly, I let my hand shake as I scribbled a shaky signature across the page. They watched closely, their faces alight with greedy triumph. My daughter reached for the papers immediately, tucking them away as though they were treasure. My son patted my shoulder gently. "You did the right thing, Dad. You won't regret this." I lowered my eyes, letting them think I was defeated, letting them believe I was too old, too weak, too confused to understand what had just happened. But deep inside, I smiled bitterly. They had no idea that while they thought they had outsmarted me, I had already laid the trap that would destroy them. What my children didn't know was that long before this night, I had already taken steps to protect myself. The moment I overheard their whispered plans, I contacted a lawyer I trusted, a man who had stood by me for years. I laid everything out for him, the pressure, the manipulation, the growing signs of betrayal. Together, we crafted a plan. The papers they thought I had signed that night. They were nothing but carefully prepared decoys, documents that held no legal power. My shaky signature had been nothing more than a performance, a role I played to feed their greed and lure them deeper into their own trap. But I hadn't stopped there. With my lawyer's guidance, I had installed small cameras throughout the house, hidden in corners they never bothered to look at. Every visit, every suspicious drink, every clouded bowl of soup was captured on film. The hushed conversations, the sly exchanges of looks, the exact moment they pushed that poisoned tea toward me. It was all recorded, evidence so damning it would leave no room for excuses. Even my doctor had become part of the plan. I had gone for a full medical evaluation and requested detailed reports on my health and mental capacity. I wanted proof that I was not weak, not confused, not incapable of making decisions. I wanted records that would stand in court if necessary, documents that showed beyond doubt that I was fully aware of my choices. So while my children sat in the living room that night, whispering excitedly about how everything was finally theirs, I lay in bed, pretending to drift into a drugged sleep. My ears caught every word, every cruel chuckle, every plan they made for what they would do once I was out of the way. My heart ached, but my mind was calm. Let them believe they had won. Let them celebrate their false victory. Every second they gloated only tightened the noose around their own necks. I wasn't the frail old man they thought I was. I wasn't blind, and I wasn't weak. I was a father who had given everything for his children and received betrayal in return. And now, I was a man who would make sure that betrayal cost them more than they could ever imagine. The morning after their so-called victory, I lay in bed pretending to be weaker than I truly was. My daughter came into the room, a forced sweetness in her voice as she asked if I needed anything. But behind her tone was a strange giddiness, as though she could barely contain her excitement. Later, I heard her whispering with my son in the hallway, their voices carrying through the thin walls. "It's done," my son said firmly. "He signed everything. We don't need to worry anymore." My daughter laughed softly, the sound sharp enough to pierce my heart. "Finally, we can start planning what to do with the place, maybe even sell it and split the money." Their words twisted inside me like knives. To hear the children I had raised, the children I had once rocked to sleep in my arms, talk about selling my home as if I were already gone, it broke something deep in me. I remembered the nights I went without food so they could eat, the mornings I left for work with aching bones just to keep the lights on, the endless sacrifices that carved the lines on my face and bent my back with age. And for what? So they could laugh about discarding me like an old coat. I wanted to storm into the hallway, to confront them then and there, to shout until my voice cracked and my chest gave out. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed silent, listening to every word, feeding the fire that burned hotter with each cruel laugh they shared. My silence was my weapon now, my calm the mask behind which I sharpened my revenge. Later that day, as I sat alone in the garden, my hands resting on the wooden arms of the chair my wife once adored, tears welled in my eyes. Not for myself, but for the family I thought I had. The realization that my love had been met with greed, that my sacrifices meant nothing to them, crushed me more than any physical blow could. But grief soon hardened into resolve. If they thought I would go quietly, they were mistaken. That night, I made a vow to myself and to the memory of my wife. They would pay for this betrayal, not just with money, not just with shame, but with the weight of knowing they had destroyed the bond of family for nothing, and that I, the father they underestimated, would be the one to bring their world crashing down. In the days that followed, my sorrow hardened into purpose. I knew that grief alone would not protect me, nor would tears heal the wound my children had carved into my heart. What I needed was proof, irrefutable, undeniable evidence that would expose their treachery for what it truly was. So I began my work quietly, without letting them suspect a thing. Every time they visited, I made sure the small cameras hidden around the house captured their every movement, their every word. I let them serve me their poisoned drinks, though I never swallowed a drop. The footage showed their hands hovering over my cup, their nervous glances as they waited for me to take a sip, the eager way they pushed papers across the table, coaxing me to sign. I gathered the signed documents they thought they had tricked me into completing and showed them to my lawyer. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head at how easily they had believed in their victory. The signatures were mine, yes, but the papers were worthless, prepared by my lawyer to appear official, yet carrying no legal weight. My children had celebrated their triumph over nothing but lies of their own making. That alone would have been satisfying, but I wasn't finished. I wanted them to face more than humiliation. I wanted them to face consequences. My doctor provided me with detailed reports of my health, proof that I was of sound mind and body. If they tried to argue that I had been too old, too frail, too confused to know what I was doing, the medical evidence would crush their lies before they left their mouths. I also began keeping a written record of every suspicious meal, every strange-tasting drink, every time they pressured me to sign something. My notebook became a diary of betrayal, each page another nail in the coffin of their schemes. I knew the day would come when I would have to reveal it all, and I wanted to be ready. Each piece of evidence was a brick in the wall I was building between myself and their greed. a wall they could never climb. They thought they were clever, weaving a web around me, but what they didn't realize was that I had turned their web into a cage. Soon, they would be the ones trapped, and I would be the one holding the key. The day of truth arrived sooner than even I had expected. My son called me one morning, his tone unusually cheerful, telling me that he and his sister would be handling some formalities regarding the property. He didn't invite me along, which only confirmed what I already knew. They believed they had secured everything. I stayed home, calm and patient, while they walked into the lion's den with nothing but forged trust and hollow triumph in their hands. At the registrar's office, they confidently presented the documents I had signed. They stood tall, their voices filled with authority, speaking as though they were the rightful heirs to everything I had built. The clerk examined the papers, flipping through them slowly, frowning at the pages as my children exchanged nervous glances. Then came the moment that turned their smugness into dread. The clerk placed the papers on the desk and said flatly, "These documents hold no legal authority. They are invalid." Confusion washed over their faces. My daughter stammered, insisting the signatures were mine. My son grew red with anger, demanding to know why they were being dismissed. That's when the doors opened, and in walked my lawyer, calm, composed, holding a folder filled with the evidence we had collected. He introduced himself to the registrar and presented the real documents, the medical reports, and the video recordings. My children's eyes widened in horror as the footage was played right there in the office. The screen showed them pouring powder into my tea, sliding papers toward me, pressuring me with false concern. Their voices echoed in that small room, every word of betrayal captured with chilling clarity. The clerk's frown deepened into disgust, and other people waiting nearby began to murmur, shaking their heads at the shameless cruelty. My children tried to explain, to twist the story, to claim it was all a misunderstanding, but the evidence was too strong, too clear. They weren't just children trying to help their father. They were manipulators caught in the act of poisoning and fraud. By the time my lawyer was finished, their reputations were already in tatters. Their so-called victory had crumbled into ashes before their very eyes. They left the office with slumped shoulders and pale faces, while I remained at home, waiting for the moment I could confront them myself. I wasn't just their father anymore. I was the man they had underestimated, and the man who had just destroyed their carefully built lies. The humiliation at the registrar's office was only the beginning. I could have stopped there, satisfied that their scheme had collapsed, but betrayal that deep cannot be answered with silence alone. They hadn't simply tried to take my home. They had tried to drug me, to weaken me, to strip me of my dignity. That was not something I could let pass. So, with my lawyer's guidance, we filed formal charges: elder abuse, attempted fraud, attempted poisoning, words that carried the weight of truth. Words that would follow them into every courtroom, every police record, every whisper in our community. When the authorities arrived at my home to review the evidence, I watched the officers' faces shift from professional calm to outrage as they saw the recordings. The cameras had captured everything. The powder poured into my cup, the pressure in their voices, the greedy triumph in their smiles when they thought I was too weak to notice. My diary of events filled in the gaps, each entry another nail sealing the case shut. The officers promised me that justice would be pursued, and for the first time in months I felt a flicker of peace. The police called my son and daughter in for questioning. I wasn't there to see it, but I heard from neighbors how pale they looked, how their voices trembled as they walked into the station. The same children who had once strutted through my house as though they owned it now had to explain themselves to men and women who saw them for what they truly were, predators preying on their own blood. The news spread quickly. In a town where everyone knows everyone, rumors travel faster than the wind. Friends who once admired my children began to distance themselves. Their colleagues whispered behind their backs. Even their in-laws, who had once fueled their greed, avoided eye contact at gatherings. My children's names, once spoken with respect, became stains in every conversation. But I wasn't done. Through my lawyer, I pushed for a restraining order, ensuring they could not come near me or the house again. The home they wanted so desperately was now the one place they could not set foot in without risking arrest. I had turned their greed into chains, their betrayal into bars. They wanted power, but now they had none. All they had left was the shame of being exposed, not just to the law, but to everyone who had ever believed their lies. The fallout was brutal, and it came faster than even I expected. Word of their betrayal spread through the family like wildfire. Cousins, uncles, aunts, neighbors, people who had once admired my children, now looked at them with disgust. At family gatherings, their names were whispered in hushed tones, followed by gasps and shaking heads. My son, who once carried himself with pride, now avoided the market for fear of the stares. My daughter, who had always loved attention, suddenly kept her head bowed in public, afraid of the questions she could no longer answer. Their shame was no longer private, it was a wound exposed for everyone to see. But the worst part for them wasn't the gossip, it was the silence. Friends stopped returning their calls. Neighbors no longer invited them over. Even their in-laws, the ones who had once encouraged their greed, pulled away, fearing the stain of association. They had become outcasts, not because of a rumor, but because of undeniable proof. The recordings, the reports, the official charges, they painted a picture no one could ignore. And then came the begging. One evening, my daughter showed up at my doorstep, tears streaming down her face, her voice trembling as she pleaded, "Dad, please, we made a mistake. We weren't thinking clearly. We just wanted to make things easier for you." Her words dripped with desperation, but I could see the same calculation in her eyes that had always been there. She wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry she had been caught. My son followed days later, his voice harder, but his words still coated with false remorse. "Dad, we went too far. We get it, but you don't have to ruin our lives over this. We're family. Can't we just move past it?" I looked at him, my heart heavy with a father's grief, but my resolve stronger than ever. "You ruined your own lives," I told him coldly. "The moment you tried to drug me, you stopped being my children. Blood may tie us, but trust is what makes us family. And you destroyed that. Their tears meant nothing to me anymore. Their pleas bounced off the walls of the home they would never inherit. They had wanted to see me weak, powerless, and broken. Instead, they saw me strong, unyielding, and unwilling to forgive. For every tear I had shed in silence, I now gave them a wound they could never heal, the wound of knowing their own father had cast them out. Taking legal action was only one part of my revenge. The other part, the most important one, was making sure that everything I had worked for, everything I had bled and sweated for, would never, under any circumstance, fall into the greedy hands of the children who had betrayed me. With my lawyer's help, I rewrote my will and secured the property in a trust that bypassed them entirely. Every asset, every account, every piece of land was carefully reassigned. My grandchildren, the innocent ones who had no part in this ugliness, were provided for. A portion of my wealth went to charity in my wife's name, ensuring her memory would live on in kindness rather than greed. And what was left went to those who had stood by me faithfully, the people who treated me with respect when my own blood could not. When the documents were finalized, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I knew that no matter how many tears my son and daughter shed, no matter how many excuses they made, they would never touch what they tried to steal. The home they once circled like vultures was now locked away from them forever. They had called me weak, but I had outsmarted them. They had called me old, but I had proved wiser than they would ever be. I remember sitting in the garden that evening, the same garden where my wife once tended to her roses, breathing in the scent of the flowers. For the first time in years, I felt peace, not because I had destroyed them, but because I had protected what mattered. The property was no longer a source of fear. It was safe, untouchable, a fortress of memories they could never invade again. When word reached them that they had been erased from the will, their rage was louder than their begging had ever been. My daughter screamed over the phone, accusing me of cruelty. My son threatened that I would regret it. But their voices held no power over me anymore. They could shout, they could curse, they could weep, but it changed nothing. Their greed had signed their exile, not me. In that moment, I realized that revenge wasn't about anger, or even about punishment. It was about reclaiming control. They had tried to strip me of my dignity, but in the end, I stripped them of their future. As the dust settled, I found myself alone in the house that carried every memory of my life. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt victorious. The walls still held my wife's laughter. The floors still carried the footsteps of my children when they were small and innocent before greed poisoned their souls. I sat in my chair by the window, looking out at the garden she had once loved, and I thought about how easily family ties can be broken. Blood is not enough to hold people together. Trust, loyalty, and love are the real bonds of family. And when those bonds are shattered, what remains is nothing more than strangers who share a name. I had given them everything, my time, my money, my years of sacrifice, my very soul, and in return they had tried to drug me, to erase me, to steal from me as though I were already dead. That kind of betrayal cannot be forgiven. That kind of cruelty cannot be forgotten. They thought I would be weak, but I showed them that even in old age I could be stronger than their schemes. They thought they could strip me of dignity, but I showed them that dignity cannot be taken. It can only be surrendered, and I never surrendered mine. The community turned its back on them, not because I demanded it, but because people could see the truth for themselves. My children had destroyed their own names with their greed, and no amount of begging or lies could wash away the stain. I did not have to lift a hand against them. Their own actions crushed them. All I did was make sure the world saw them for what they were. In the end, I secured my home, my legacy, and my peace. They walked away empty-handed, burdened by the knowledge that their father, the man they thought they could break, was the one who broke them instead. And so I sit here, older, perhaps a little lonelier, but unbowed. My message is simple. Family is not just blood. Family is loyalty, respect, and love. If your children betray you, they are not family. They are strangers wearing the mask of kin. My children tried to drug me for my property, but in the end, it was they who swallowed the bitter taste of their own betrayal.